All right. So
Yeah.
I think I'm audible and visible now. So good evening, friends. I heartily welcome you all. Thank you so much for investing your valuable time with us today evening. My name is Gautam Vegda. I'm a research scholar and a Dalit writer writing in English. Right now, I'm serving as an assistant professor at Gujarat Debit. Uh, Today, we have an amazing lecture on the title Philosophy is concerned with knowing truth, religion is concerned with the love of truth. Some remarks on the uses of two words, religion and philosophy, in Ambedkar's thought. Right. So today before diving into our debate or our discussion or the lecture, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Vaibhav Abnave. Right. Vaibhav Abnave is an independent researcher and filmmaker. His research interest lies at the intersection of politics, history, and philosophy. Through his films, he explores the intersection of theater and cinema, documentary and fiction. He has taught courses in international politics and documentary filmmaking and theater studies at various educational institutions in India. Right. His films Blur 2008, Monologue 2013 have have been shown at various international film festivals. Right. He is associated with Prabuddha collection, which seeks to think conversion for our times. Right. So this is how like I have introduced him, and Vaibhav, I think you'll get 30 minutes or so to speak uh, about the topic, and then we will start question answer session where we can in a way debate or discussion or make some discussions regarding
Sure.
your
Sure.
topic. Right. So yeah,
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you, Gautam, and thank you, Pradhani. Thank you, Bapsa CUG, for this generous invitation. It's really a privilege to speak today. So let me start with the quotation cited in the first part of my rather longish and cumbersome title. Philosophy is concerned with knowing truth, religion is concerned with the love of truth. As many of you are aware of, this line I have cited is from B.R. Ambedkar's Philosophy of Hinduism, a work of extraordinary erudition and shattering insights. Along with revolution and counter-revolution in ancient India and riddles in Hinduism, this work forms a kind of triptych, a trilogy of Ambedkar's rigorous, systematic, and scathing critique of Hinduism as an ideology which officially propagates inequality, unfreedom, and callous indifference. An ideology whose everyday effects are too real, chaotic, shape-shifting, and devastatingly violent to maintain a cognitive awareness of its cold-blooded systemicity. And yet, Ambedkar, while performing an ideological critique of Hinduism, uses the word philosophy and titles his work Philosophy of Hinduism. Is he simply equating philosophy with ideology, using them synonymously or interchangeably to suggest that philosophy of Hinduism is nothing but an ideology, where ideology is nothing but distortion of truth, disservice to truth? It will become clear in the course of our discussion that this is not quite the case. Ambedkar is neither equating philosophy with ideology nor using them interchangeably. Now, before we discuss what the word philosophy is doing in the title of this work, Philosophy of Hinduism, let us return to the citation with which we began. Philosophy is concerned with knowing truth, religion is concerned with the love of truth. Now, on the one hand, a superficial reading of this citation may produce an impression that for Ambedkar, there is a presumed hierarchy between philosophy and religion, where philosophy has mere conceptual, theoretical, abstract, which is to say cold, distant, objective, almost academic relation with truth. While religion has a concrete, experiential, visceral, affective, in other words, intensely personal and subjective relation with truth. It may appear that for Ambedkar, the superiority of religion over philosophy is essentially the superiority of loving over mere knowing. For many, this inferred superiority of religion over philosophy would also resonate with, and many find it homologous to, the contemporary debate where embodied experience is argued to be superior to abstract theory in both ethical and political sense. Yet, a speculative reading of Ambedkar-thought, as suggested and forcefully demonstrated by Soumyabrata Chaudhary in Ambedkar and Other Immortal, could open up another way of thinking the relation between philosophy and religion in Ambedkar-thought. To begin with, one cannot help noticing two crucial moves Ambedkar makes. First, he triangulates the relation between religion and philosophy through a third common term, that is, truth. Ambedkar makes it clear that at the inauguration of both philosophy and religion, there is truth. If it were not for the coming into existence of truth in this world, neither philosophy nor religion would have any meaning whatsoever. And truth is neither philosophical nor religious, which is to say, neither of them have any special claim nor privileged access to truth. Truth is axiomatic, that is self-founded, immanent, that is this worldly, and universal, that truth is for anyone. So the relation between philosophy and religion in Ambedkar-thought can only be grasped in the light of their respective relation with truth. Now comes the second move, where Ambedkar says, religion is concerned with the love of truth. Here one cannot help noticing an allusion to the literal meaning of the word philosophy, which is love of wisdom. One could speculate that Ambedkar wants to produce certain effect through the word religion, which was similar to the one produced in the ancient Athens through the word philosophy. If one were to ask what was that intended effect which the word philosophy produced, the answer to this question would tell us something crucial about the nature of truth itself and why one needs to love the truth than merely knowing it. The nature of truth is, to use the great contemporary philosopher Alabadio's precise term, the nature of truth is objective, which is to say that one cannot have mere objective, factual, empirical, and neutral access to truth without there being subjective and partisan commitment to truth. A commitment which at once propels exceptional change in the life of the committed and the world in which she lives. A commitment which produces subjective indifference towards the worldly measurable gains like power, prestige, status, money, and in return gives immeasurable happiness. In other words, truth is not reducible to mere knowledge and its accumulation. But truth is that which inaugurates an exceptional and inexhaustible process of change in this world, a process of subjective as well as social change. And such a change becomes thinkable, becomes actual only when one loves the truth, passionately and freely, without even caring about one's death. In other words, when one loves truth, one lives as if one is an immortal. In the ancient Athens, the Platonic usage of the word philosophy intended to invoke love of truth, especially among the young ones, by creating a new desire for truth, a desire which would create a disinterest towards material goods. No wonder this Socratic Platonic effect met with a serious political allegation in its own times, that of corrupting the youth. Now one would ask, if Ambedkar intended to create a similar effect, that of invoking the love of truth by using the word religion, then why didn't he use the word philosophy itself? Did Ambedkar had certain apathy towards the word philosophy? Or was it the other way around, that Ambedkar used these two words, philosophy and religion, interchangeably and synonymously? A closer look at the passage from which this citation, philosophy is concerned with knowing truth and religion is concerned with the love of truth, when we look at the passage from which this citation is taken, it would help us begin to think through these questions. The passage opens as follows: that Atman and Brahman were one was the truth, the great truth which the Upanishads said they had discovered. And they asked man to know this truth. The philosophers of Upanishads did not realize that to know truth was not enough. One must learn to love truth. The difference between philosophy and religion may be put in two ways. And here comes the citation with which we began. Philosophy is concerned with knowing truth. Religion is concerned with the love of truth. Now, if we come to this citation in relation to the lines earlier in the passage, it becomes clear that Ambedkar's problem is not with the word philosophy per se, the way it was used by the ancient Athenians to create a new desire for truth. His problem is with the philosophers of Upanishads, who did not realize that to know truth was not enough. If one reads the above mentioned passage from Philosophy of Hinduism along with another passage from Riddles in Hinduism, Ambedkar's differentiated stance vis-a-vis Brahmaism, or what he calls Brahmavad, that is the philosophy of Upanishads, and Ambedkar's stance on the word philosophy as used by ancient Athenians, the distinction between the two would become clearer. In Riddles, Ambedkar writes, if all persons are parts of Brahma, then all are equal. And all must enjoy the same liberty, which is what democracy means. To recognize and realize that you and I are parts of the same cosmic principle leaves room for no other theory of associated life except democracy. The question is, what happened to this doctrine of Brahmaism or Brahmavad? Ambedkar responds, it's quite obvious that Brahmaism had no social effects. It was not made the basis of dharma. When asked why this happened, the answer is that Brahmaism is only philosophy, as though philosophy arises not out of social life, but out of nothing and for nothing. Now, in this quote from Riddles, it becomes clearer that Ambedkar's objection is not to the word philosophy as coined by the ancient Athenians and its Platonic usage, but what he thought to be its reduction by the Upanishadkar, reduction of Brahmaism to being only philosophy, having no social effects, having no impact upon subjective desire for the truth. In another text, which is a speech, Ranade, Gandhi and Jinnah, Ambedkar extends this objection to an entire field of what he calls Hindu philosophy, within which he situates Upanishads and its philosophy of Brahmaism. In Ranade, Jinnah, Gandhi and Jinnah, he writes, Hindu philosophy, whether it is Vedanta, Sankhya, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, has moved in its own circle without in any way affecting the Hindu religion. Hindu philosophy has never had the courage to challenge the gospel of Hinduism. That Hindu philosophy that everything is Brahma remained only a matter of intellect. It never became a social philosophy. The Hindu philosophers had both their philosophy and their manu held apart in two hands. The right not knowing what the left hand. The Hindu is never troubled by their inconsistency. Now, Ambedkar's shattering distinction between Hindu philosophy and social philosophy at once exposes the asocial nature of Hindu philosophy while affirming the effects of a philosophy worthy of its name as essentially social. His objection to the capture of the word philosophy by the name Hindu becomes even sharper as he moves from Hindu philosophy to what he calls philosophy of Hinduism. If the former, despite its intellectual richness, complexity, and subtlety, remained only a matter of intellect, remained only philosophy having no social effects or real material consequences for this world, then the latter, that is philosophy of Hinduism, was overtly and officially antisocial. In another passage from Philosophy of Hinduism, Ambedkar writes, "What is the explanation of absence of fraternity among the Hindus? It is Hinduism and its philosophy that is responsible for it. There is no sharing among Hindus of joys and sorrows involved in the vital facts of life. Everything is separate and exclusive. With a complete refusal to share the joys and sorrows of life, how can the sentiment of fraternity take roots? The question of all questions is, why do the Hindus refuse to share the joys and sorrows of life? It needs no saying that he refuses to share because his religion tells him not to share them. This conclusion need cause no surprise. For what does Hinduism teach? It teaches not to interdine, not to intermarry, not to associate. The philosophy of Hinduism is a direct denial of fraternity. Against this officially antisocial philosophy of Hinduism, Ambedkar continues to affirm the inexhaustible possibilities opened up by the ancient Athenian usage of the word philosophy. In Riddles in Hinduism, he writes, "Philosophy is no purely theoretic matter. It has practical potentialities. Philosophy has its roots in the problems of life, and whatever theories philosophy propounds must return to society as instruments of reconstructing society. It is not enough to know." It is quite clear from this passage that for Ambedkar, philosophy in its true sense is not about mere knowing, but about reconstructing society, changing the world, subjectively as well as socially. In other words, the task of philosophy is to produce social effects, subjective and social change, not through mere knowledge of truth, but out of the love of truth. But didn't Ambedkar say that religion is concerned with the love of truth? Does that mean that for Ambedkar, the words philosophy and religion are interchangeable and synonymous? A question which we raised earlier. Now, at this point, it would be useful to pause and to turn to the last few lines of that passage from Philosophy of Hinduism with which we started. Earlier, we saw the opening few lines before we arrived at the quotation or the citation which is in the title of today's talk. Philosophy is concerned with knowing truth, religion is concerned with the love of truth. Later in the passage, Ambedkar writes, "Philosophy is static, religion is dynamic. These differences are merely two aspects of one and the same thing. Philosophy is static because it is concerned only with knowing truth. Religion is dynamic because it is concerned with the love of truth." This passage makes it clear that for Ambedkar, at one level, both philosophy and religion are same, insofar as both are concerned with truth. But at another level, they are different too. For he says philosophy is static, religion is dynamic. Now, everything hinges upon how we read the two predicates, static and dynamic. Again, a superficial and in a certain sense commonsensical reading would suggest an implicit hierarchy between the two words, static and dynamic, where the latter, that is dynamic, could be taken to be superior and desirable than the former. For static is that which stands still, rigid, resistant to change, and thus dead, while dynamic is that which is flexible, moving, changing, alive, vital. Yet again, if we were to resist the temptation of such a reading, then another speculative reading of these two predicates, static and dynamic, is thinkable. where the relation between static and dynamic can be thought dialectically than preferring one over the other. And also keeping in mind that both static and dynamic are not merely attributes of philosophy and religion, but they tell us something about how truth emerges or comes into existence in this world. If the emergence of truth in this world has to be grasped dialectically, then one has to keep in mind that truth emerges in a concrete historical situation, producing exceptional change in that situation. Yet, this truth is at once eternal, axiomatic, and immutable. That is, if it is truth, then it has to be true for any situation, future as well as past. In other words, truth produces what Soumyavrata Chaudhary calls reversible eternity, having at once retrospective effect on the past as well as anticipatory effect on the future to come. Now, if one approaches static and dynamic in dialectical manner, then static can be read as referring to eternal, axiomatic, universal, and infinite validity of any truth, while dynamic can be read as historical, material, emancipatory, dispositional consequences produced by contingent emergence and intervention by truth in a concrete situation or the world. In other words, static refers to eternity of truth, while dynamic refers to effectivity, historical, material effectivity of truth. Now here, one can take a short example from Soumyavrata Chaudhary's book Ambedkar and Other Immortals, where he wagers that the norm of equality, in other words, the truth of equality, the principle of equality was declared in 1927 at Mahad by Ambedkar. And this was an event, an evental rupture in Indian history. Yet, the declaration of the norm of equality has simultaneously 4 effects. The first effect is that equality does not require any foundation. Equality does not require the creator God who makes all men equal in his own image. In other words, equality is axiomatic. The second effect it produces is that in the light of this truth of equality, which emerged in the concrete situation of Indian history, has retrospective as well as anticipatory effects for the future. What are those effects? In the light of the declaration of the norm of equality, Ambedkar divides the field of Indian history into revolution and counter-revolution, the Buddhist revolution and Brahminical counter-revolution. And the other consequences that in the light of the axiomatic truth of equality, Ambedkar forces the emerging post-colonial Indian state to undertake the actual process of material equalization in predicative sense. So the second effect Chaudhary calls is a predicative equalization. And the most contested example of this predicative equalization remains positive discrimination, or what is popularly called reservations. Then there is the third consequence of the emergence of the truth of equality, and that is dispositional. So it is not sufficient to declare the axiomatic truth of equality. It is not sufficient to equalize the unequals. But it is also important to treat the unequals equally, to behave equally with unequals, which is to say that to live associated life of fraternity, which, to use the Pali word, metta, Ambedkar produces a new effect that through the Buddhist revolution, the norm of equality produced a new dispositional consequence, that is metta or maitri or fraternity. And then there is the fourth consequence, which is the idea of a generic equality, which is to say that the norm of equality is not simply applicable to the Indian situation, but it's applicable to any situation, anywhere, at any point of time. So now returning to the words static and dynamic, from where we digressed into this example, we can speculate that for Ambedkar, the relation between philosophy, which is static, and religion, which is dynamic, is essentially dialectical. They are same and yet different, and these differences are merely two aspects of one and the same thing, is what Ambedkar says. So how do you read this, that these differences are merely two aspects of one and the same thing? One could speculate that Ambedkar suggests a dialectical interplay of identity and difference between these two words, philosophy and religion, where philosophy affirms the eternity of truth, separating it from mere opinions, while religion activates effectivity of truth in history. Both philosophy and religion, in their true sense, create new subjective desire for truth, but they do it differently. Which is to say, their difference does not add up to one, so they remain dialectically interlinked, separate yet inseparable. Now, taking off from Alabatio, one could suggest that philosophy creates desire for truth by subtracting itself from the actual effectivity of truths unfolding in history through four distinct truth procedures: science, love, art, and politics. In other words, four creative processes through which truths emerge, actualize, and unfold in history. While religion not only creates desire for truth, but also sustains the effectivity and organizes the consequences of political truths, such as liberty, equality, and fraternity, by giving a concrete material form to collective coexistence that for Ambedkar is society, or for Karl Marx, generic humanity. In short, the dialectical relation between philosophy and religion can only be grasped if one triangulates it with the third term, which is political truth, or what Alabatio says, politics as truth process or truth procedure. The dialectical relation between philosophy and religion, as proposed by Ambedkar, can be further grasped when we look at the two simultaneous operations Ambedkar performed on both these words, philosophy and religion. Now, in order to perform these simultaneous operations, Ambedkar, as we discussed, does not begin with either of them. He begins with political truths, or what he calls principles: liberty, equality, and fraternity, which are universal, axiomatic, and produce material dispositional consequences in history. Now, what are these two simultaneous operations we are talking about? On the one hand, he approaches the word religion from the side of philosophy, producing a philosophical separation between what he calls religion of rules, that is Dharma or Hinduism, and religion of principles, that is Dhamma or Buddhism. At this point, I would not elaborate upon this distinction, but we can take it up during the discussion. On the other hand, approaching from the side of philosophy, from the word philosophy, Ambedkar, on the other hand, approaching the word philosophy from the side of religion, Ambedkar makes a certain religious, or to be specific, political separation between only philosophy, that is scholastic, theoretic, academicist philosophy as mere knowing, and social philosophy, which has its roots in the problems of life and which returns to society as instruments of reconstructing society. So through these simultaneous operations, Ambedkar dialecticizes both philosophy and religion, producing certain split or division into both these words. So the split we saw, the split between the religion of rules and religion of principles, and philosophy as mere knowing in scholastic sense, and social philosophy, which reconstruct society. Now, this simultaneous dialectical operation, which takes off from political truths as its axiomatic starting point, one again remind us that truth divides. So Ambedkar's dialectical operation reminds us once more that truth has a divisive function. It divides philosophy into academic and social philosophy, religion into religion of rules and religion of principles. Each of these splits or divisions are mediated, or to be precise, triangulated by truth, which is political truths, only to illuminate each other in the light of the other. By raising two fundamental questions simultaneously: what is philosophy and what is religion? Now, one could make some brief remarks on this simultaneous dialectical operation, which is the first operation by which one approaches religion from the side of philosophy is a universal operation on the common word religion, by raising the question, what is religion, and proposing a certain idea of religion. While the second operation is at once a universal operation, which is asking the question, what is philosophy, or what is the true task of philosophy, that which returns to reconstruct the society. And in the light of that, the second operation also makes a singular intervention into the historical non-effectivity of philosophy in Indian history. That there was something like a philosophy, but it could not really produce real material historical effects of reconstructing the society. The second operation is crucial to understand Ambedkar's decision on the word or a generic name religion, and his decision on the proper name Dhamma, instead of the old Athenian name philosophy. Now let's look at Ambedkar's decision here as something which is triggered due to Hindu separation of philosophy as mere knowing and speculation, and social change produced a singular situation. So the mere knowing and social change, which were separated from each other, produced a certain singular historical situation in India, where the name religion, that is Dhamma, played the historical task of changing or orienting the desire, creating a collective desire for truth, intervening and reconstructing society. Due to the Brahminical indifference towards the social, philosophy could not produce the social effects it could otherwise had. In other words, Hindu philosophy could neither affect nor change the Hindu religion. Hindu philosophy could not reconstruct the Indian society because knowing the truth remained uncoupled or disconnected from the love of truth. Now I'll come to the last part of my talk, where let me come to Ambedkar's two near identical formulations on the function of philosophy and religion, which on the one hand, according to him, mirror each other, while on the other hand, these two near identical mirror-like formulations also speak of Ambedkar's unequivocal decision on the generic name religion and its proper name Buddhism or Dhamma. In his last speech, Buddha or Marx, Ambedkar affirms what remains of the Karl Marx is a residue of fire, small but still very important. This residue in Ambedkar's view consists of four elements, of which the first concerns us. What is that first element? Ambedkar says, the function of philosophy is to reconstruct the world and not to waste its time in explaining the origins of the world. Now, one can immediately hear the echo of the thesis on Feuerbach, where Marx unequivocally says that the philosophers previously have interpreted the world. The point is to change it. So Ambedkar has a certain Marxian take on the word philosophy, is that which reconstructs the world. Then later, while discussing the creed of Buddha, which he decides upon over the creed of Marx, Ambedkar writes, the function of religion is to reconstruct the world and to make it happy and not to explain its origin or its end. Now, in the middle of 20th century, when Ambedkar proposes this near identical formulation that the function of philosophy is to reconstruct the world and the function of religion is to reconstruct the world, and yet he chooses the latter over the former. So it again brings back to the same question. If both philosophy and religion have the same function, that of reconstructing the world, then are they two names of the same thing? Why did Ambedkar decide one name over the other? In a certain speculative explanation we discussed earlier, because of the singular historical situation of India, where the philosophy remained uncoupled from social change. But I think one can speculate something more here. Here, one has to keep in mind that when Ambedkar sees philosophy as an instrument of social change, he's not only alluding to the 19th century Marxist linking, or to use a more technical word from Alabadiou, suture or stitching together of philosophy and politics as nearly synonymous with each other. Alabadiou says that in 19th century, philosophy gets knotted or stitched or sutured with three of its conditions. And what are the conditions of philosophy? Conditions of philosophy is basically coming into existence of truth in this world. And as we saw, that the truth emerges in world through four distinct truth processes: science, art, politics, and love. So what happens in 19th century, that on the one hand, philosophy is almost made synonymous with science, and which produces positivism. On the other hand, philosophy is almost made synonymous with politics, and which produces a certain Marxist conviction, and also Ambedkar's own conviction that the task of philosophy is to reconstruct the world. And on the other hand, philosophy is knitted together or stitched with art, and it produces the romantic conviction that art has a privileged access to truth, and basically the task of philosophy and the task of art, or poetry, to be precise, poetry, is one and the same. Now, on the light of the suture of philosophy and politics, one can understand why Ambedkar says that the function of philosophy is to reconstruct the world. Because for Ambedkar, both philosophy and religion were egalitarian politics, were two names of egalitarian politics. Both were instruments of bringing about emancipatory social transformation. In other words, both were instruments of politics. So philosophy and religion, in this sense, were both instruments of egalitarian politics by proxy. Yet, there is something in Ambedkar which, in a way, orients us to depart from his Marxian conviction that the task of philosophy is to reconstruct the world. And Alabadiou reminds us in the second half of 20th century that philosophy needs to uncouple from any of its, or destituted from any of its truth condition. Philosophy cannot be made synonymous either with science or with art or with politics. The task of philosophy has to be reformulated, restated. Now, in the light of Badiou's this operation, which he calls a subtractive operation, we can look at Ambedkar's relation with historical Marxism. So unlike Lenin, in Ambedkar, the question of politics is reposed as the question of subjective change, and not as the question of seizing the power. The question of politics for Ambedkar is a question of constructing a new duration of politics, and not as the question of what is to be done with a certain frenzied impatience. For Ambedkar, the question of politics is a question of organization at a distance from the state, and not as the capture of the state power by the vanguardist party. Now here we can, in our own voice, speak of the relation of philosophy and religion in our own times. And here, in a way, one can extract certain consequences from Ambedkar-thought, but yet decide in our own voice. Now, today, I would suggest that we have to reformulate the dialectic between philosophy and religion. The relation between them remains dialectical, but the content of this dialectical relation has to be reformulated. So the first task is that we cannot stitch or suture philosophy with one of its conditions, that is politics. Today, instead of knotting philosophy and politics, we need to state, as Alabadiou reminds us, that philosophy cannot be equated with any of its conditions. We have to say unequivocally that the task of philosophy is not to change the world, which is the task of politics, but the task of philosophy is to create a new subjective desire for truth, and to compose the truths produced in various domains in one's own time, without creating any hierarchic relation between them. So today, after the delinking of philosophy and politics, the dialectical relation between religion and philosophy needs to be reformulated by posing politics as the collective pursuit of justice, whose end cannot be the capture of state power. So today, after Alabadio, the question of philosophy, or what is philosophy and its function, has to be reposed. In that situation, it is crucial for us to return to the dialectical relation between philosophy and religion, not only at the level of the Indian political, but also at the level of international. At an international level, Ambedkar wagers in 1956 the name religion, or its proper name Buddhism, can help us reinvent communism or the communist hypothesis. Once he even says that Buddhist communism is preferable over the Marxist communism in Myanmar. The question of religion needs to be situated on the side of emancipatory and egalitarian politics as the question of subjective change, the question of organization beyond the party-state modality, of organizing new political time, and also the question of construction of new symbolic order. Now, what is that? I'll just come briefly. Essentially, all of this implies we need to unsettle the false contradiction today we are faced with, which is between liberal, democratic, individualist capitalism on the one hand and reactionary religious fundamentalism on the other. The question of religion today has to approach from the side of philosophy once again, and not from the side of theology or mysticism. Now, approaching the question of religion from the side of philosophy today will enable us to produce a new knot between religion and politics, where religion is to be understood as a new collective desire for organizing the consequences of political truths, liberty, equality, and fraternity, to also resolve the tension between liberty, equality, and fraternity. So in a certain sense today, religion will help us think politics as a collective pursuit of justice at a distance from the state power. Now, let's just briefly look at the contemporary situation of philosophy as well as religion, which can help us, in a way, understand the challenges and the immense obstacles we are faced with. Now, today, everyone more or less would agree that philosophy is in a sick state, and it is unable either to make a separation between opinion, mere opinions, dogma, and truths. In fact, there are several currents in the 20th century has led to this saturation of philosophy. I'll just name some of them. The first is inaugurated by Martin Heidegger, which is the deconstruction of metaphysics. The other two traditions, hermeneutic tradition, phenomenological tradition. Then the consequences of it one could see in the linguistic turn, as well as this kind of artificial separation between the analytical and the continental philosophy, and so on and so forth. All of this together has deconstructed the metaphysics and has proclaimed the end of philosophy. And here philosophy is equated with something which is a part of the classical metaphysics, and today we need to, in a way, overcome this desire for philosophy, because the desire for philosophy is a desire for something totalitarian, something authoritarian, and so on and so forth. So all of these tendencies, historicist, logicist, phenomenological, hermeneutic, together has reduced truth to mere belief or interpretation. So we can no longer make separation between knowledge and truth. The academicist banishment of dialectics as authoritarian and totalizing has led to celebration of non-dialectical differences or multiple. Then along with it comes the valorization or celebration of body and experience and viscerality and so on and so forth. All of this Badiou sums up as democratic materialism, which is to say that there are only bodies and languages. Now, with this theme of the end of metaphysics and end of philosophy, which cuts across the academic institutions all over the world, has produced a certain kind of a disciplinary capture of philosophy, where philosophy has either been reduced to a discipline in an academic sense, or philosophy is proclaimed as something which we have to done away with. So all of this resonate a common theme of closure and death, and saturates any possible thinking, imagination, or desire for another world. Now, the question of desire is very crucial today. That what has happened to the question of desire? The question of desire is solely reduced to endless, insatiable desire for commodities that is driven by market. And this desire can only be regulated again through violent, ascetic, sacrificial means, that is through a certain theologized religion. That is the false contradiction we are faced with today. That on the one hand, you have the insatiable desire for commodities, or this desire has to be resisted by taking a shelter into reactionary religions through violent, ascetic, and sacrificial means. Now, what is the contemporary situation of the name religion, and why today it is difficult to think religion on the side of emancipatory politics? Which was not the case in the times of Ambedkar. In fact, till 1970s, there was a open possibility for thinking a religion on the side of emancipatory politics. Today, the name religion is associated with two tendencies. At its best, it is reserved for private belief of faith, spiritual, mystical inner experience and healing, corporatized social service, and invaluable civilizational inheritance, which adds to cultural diversity and plurality and richness. Or at its worst, religion is equated with reactionary, intolerant, fundamentalist, identitarian, majoritarian, and violent tendencies. Today, unlike Ambedkar's conviction, religion is not thought as capable of confronting the asymbolic order that capitalism thrives upon. What is basically a symbolic order? Basically, it's a crisis of value, that money becomes the sole referent for value. So everything is valued in relation to money, and that produces what Alabadio calls a symbolic order or a lack of symbolic order. And the asymbolic order that capitalism thrives upon exploits and further intensifies, exacerbating subjective confusion, disorientation, cynicism, and nihilism. And at least since the Iranian Revolution, any possible knotting of religion and politics is seen with great apprehension, for it would lead to theocracy and authoritarian state. The implication of philosophy's sixth state today is that it can no longer split the reactionary mobilization of the name religion from its possible reactivation as a resource for emancipatory politics. It can no longer separate rigor of ritual from the love of truth. It can no longer separate theological aura from the force of truth. Also, the implication of religion's sixth state today is that it can no longer contribute towards cultivation of disinterested interest and desire for truth. Religion today can no longer split the academicist philosophy from social philosophy, the way Ambedkar proposed in the middle of or the first half of 20th century. Now, in this situation, the philosophy would have to break out of its academicist impasse, which is university discourse, and work towards creating a new subjective desire for truth, that it has to take up its old age task of corrupting the youth. While religion today has to mobilize a proper name, which for Ambedkar is Dhamma or Buddhism, to take up the question of organization beyond the party-state modality and national identitarian enclosures. So religion today would have to take up the task of organizing collective with internationalist vision and orientation. Also, religion today will have to take up the task of construction of new political time, which is neither on the side of state, which is a certain eternity, nor on the side of mass movements, which has a certain ephemeral tendency. So religion today will have to produce a new conception of politics as pursuit of collective justice at a distance from the state, till the state withers away. Because unlike in Ambedkar's time, when a possibility of another world was there, which is no longer there, one is living in the world saturated by capitalism and liberal democracy. So today, when the thought and desire for another world is no longer available, religion would have to work together with philosophy for creation and cultivation of that thought and desire. Again, religion would have to split today the academicist and the social part of philosophy, and the philosophy would again have to split the religion of rules and religion of principles, or the reactionary fundamentalist religion and the emancipatory religion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, my mic was muted. So thank you so much for your insightful and incisive lecture. All right. And I think there is a question
Yeah,
by Prashant.
Prashant.
He says that thank you, Vaibhav, for your talk. My question would be, in politics of truth, how do we understand Dhamma and Dharma when it's received differently?
Uh, First of all, Prashant, thank you so much for this question. I would say that let's first differentiate between politics of truth and politics as truth process. And that difference is very, very crucial, because politics of truth comes from a certain Foucauldian side where there is a constant apprehension of the knotting of truth and power, knowledge and power. So politics of truth there produces a certain cynical conception of politics, where politics is no longer separable from war. And Alabadio very forcefully makes this argument in his critique of Foucault's work, where he says that for Foucault, war and politics almost becomes synonymous via Clausewitz and Machiavelli and others, where politics is war by other means and war is politics by other means, and so on and so forth. And there emerges precisely the question of violence, which concerns both Alabadio as well as Ambedkar, that politics cannot simply be violence or war. Politics has to be about transformation of this world without necessarily limiting oneself to the capture of the state power. And this has to be seen again historically. So let me come here to politics as truth process. Now, what is a truth process? A truth process is that which unfolds in history in sequences. So today we say the modern political truth process is inaugurated by the French Revolution, and the first sequence runs from French Revolution roughly to 1848. The second from 1848 to 1871, which is Paris Commune. Then the third from 1871 to October Revolution. The fourth from October Revolution to Mao's Cultural Revolution, or May 1968, and the fourth is the latest is the one we are living in, post May 68 and after the collapse of Soviet Union. Now, I'm not getting into the details of any of these sequences. The crucial point for us to understand here is that the question of the effectivity of truth leads to the splitting of truth process into sequences. That effectivity of certain truth is saturated, which is why that truth has to be reactivated or recommenced. So after French Revolution, it produced certain bourgeois effects, which is valorization of liberty and so on. And the name nation was captured in the territorial sovereignist identitarian sense. The name people had to be reactivated, and there Marx proposes another name, proletariat. But then comes the question of the organization of proletariat after Paris Commune. And there Lenin proposes a new resolution, which is a vanguardist resolution of organization of the proletariat through party, and to capture the state power in order to traverse through, in order to liquidate the state power, or what he calls the withering away of the state. Now, when Ambedkar comes, he says, but why did the withering away of the state did not happen? What were the reasons? And here he fundamentally raises a very crucial question, that was there a political horizon which was opened and made thinkable beyond the capture of state power in October Revolution? So in a certain sense, the success of October Revolution paves way for its own saturation, its own lack of effectivity in 1930s, 40s, and 50s, which leads to authoritarian tendencies and so on. Now, Ambedkar proposes a new resolution, and here he proposes the name Dhamma to reinvent the truth of communism at a distance from the state. Which is to say that we need to think of the organization of people simultaneously at national and international level outside of the model of party state. And in a certain way, a decade after Ambedkar, Mao is also trying to think on the same lines, which is how to liquidate the party state nexus, and how to, in a way, recommence the process of revolution where people can take charge of their own destiny instead of the bureaucratic party, which is kind of holding on to power and so on. So I think that the question of religion for Ambedkar and the proper name Dhamma comes here at this precise historical moment, which is after the saturation of the party state modality. And which is why today I think it has to be thought within this truth process inaugurated by French Revolution, rather than simply counterposing Dhamma to historical Marxism. Historical Marxism has to be critiqued, both at Indian as well as at international level. The party form of Marxism has to be critiqued for all reasons which are known to us. We need not reiterate them here. But at the same time, the crucial task is to retain the name communism. That is what Alabadiou says, that maybe the task of this or the next century is basically to keep the word communism alive and to reinvent communist hypothesis by separating it from historical Marxism. Historical Marxism does not exhaust the possibilities opened up by the word communism. And in that sense, the word communism goes as back to Plato, to the ancient times, and so on, to Republic, and so on. So probably, I think the question of religion and politics has simultaneously these two dimensions. One, as I said, is a classical dimension, where all along during the classical period, which is essentially ancient and the medieval period, the relation between religion and politics was thought dialectically. But today, that dialectics requires a historical reformulation. And Ambedkar, I think, shows us a way of how to do that. Now, I think the distinction between the Dharma and Dhamma part, which you are proposing, which is very, very crucial today, that today, in a certain sense, people have refolded the intensity and the force inaugurated by the word Dhamma, again in a ritualized form, Dharma. So today, how again we make the name Dhamma thinkable on the side of egalitarian politics and not simply on the side of cultural, ritualized kind of celebration of a certain kind. If I may add, Gautam, one more thing. So, which is why essentially that, as you read in your introduction, that the task of the collective, of which I am associated with, is basically has undertaken this task of rethinking conversion for our times, which is how do we rethink the name Dhamma today and its relation to the communist hypothesis, and at the same time challenging the majoritarian capture by the Hindutva forces, which should not be separated from Hindu-ness. So this liberal separation between good Hindu and Hindutva has to be resisted at any cost, and the name Hindu in all its forms and ambiguities and shape-shifting nature has to be challenged, but the aspiration of the name Dhamma and its stakes has to be raised at internationalist level, as at the level of reinventing communist hypothesis. So, yeah. So away from Hindus and away from capital is kind of the slogan of Prabhuddha Collective.
All right. So that's what I was like about to ask, like what is this Prabuddha collective, and like how are you like associated with that, and how it works, how it functions, right? So that is how like I wanted to ask, but yeah.
So
So
I mean, I already told you about a certain kind of a larger intellectual project, which is essentially political. We are attempting to undertake. Well, about its functionality, say basically, it started with Ambedkar and Other Immortals, Soumyavrata Chaudhary's book, around which a certain workshop happened in Gandhinagar in 2018. So it's quite interesting that we are returning to Bapsa CUG, where we are again, in a certain sense, returning to Gandhinagar, where this process was inaugurated. So after this workshop, in the light of Soumyavrata Chaudhary's book, we collectively started reading Buddha and his Dhamma, along with Ambedkar and Other Immortals, along with the question of philosophy raised and reformulated by Alabadiou, along with psychoanalysis, particularly the Slovenian school, which is spearheaded by Slavoj Žižek, Mladen Dolar, Alenka Zupančič, and so on. So that is one side of it. And the other thing which we have undertaken is basically to rethink the relation between art, philosophy, and politics. Because unlike the 20th century, we can no longer merely think art as instrument of emancipatory politics, or we cannot merely think art as an instrument to transmit certain ideas, but we have to affirm today that art is capable of producing its own singular thought. So in a certain sense, the singularity of art today can create a new desire for politics. That is what we believe.
yes. So I have another question in mind.
Yeah.
How do you see philosophy as social change? Like once you mentioned there, so
Sure,
how
sure.
do you see philosophy as social change at present time or in present time in India?
Yeah, yeah,
And do you think that there is any active philosophy in India which functions in this particular way, like
sure,
in order
sure.
to construct or reconstruct society, or it transforms the society or something like that?
Sure, sure. I
Yeah.
would say that the return of this old Athenian Greek name philosophy in our present contemporary discourse is operating at the margins of university. So here the word philosophy should not be confused with its scholastic academicist uses, right? So the word philosophy has entered with a new Ambedkarite vigor and rigor of politics in last 10, 12 years. So in a certain sense, the word philosophy returns via Ambedkar. So on the one hand, through this old word reformulated by Alabadiyo, Shomyavrata Chaudhary, Aishwarya Kumar, and several others, young scholars of our times, have opened up a new possibility of reading Ambedkar speculatively, which is wagering on Ambedkar thought and yet speaking in one's own voice, and separating this new Ambedkarite politics from Ambedkarite orthodoxy, which in a certain sense has saturated. On the other hand, what this word philosophy is doing today is basically it is illuminating Ambedkarite operation on Indian history, which is the separation between revolution and counter-revolution. So there is this new intense consciousness that there was a Buddhist revolution, and there is an increasing, I would say, I wouldn't use the word attraction here, but I would say a certain kind of a desire for conversion, which we see among the non-Mahar SCs, among the OBCs, among the caste Hindus, and so on. And it is only going to grow. And it is only going to take the majoritarian capture of the Indian state head on. So that there is no question about that. So the word philosophy today has returned through this new desire for conversion, to change. And what is conversion here? Conversion is basically a subjective change, which is change of one's conduct, one's dispositions, one's thinking, and so on and so forth. So that is the site at which philosophy is acting. So, and the third site I'm going to talk about is basically these independent Ambedkarite organizations or associations which have emerged, of which BAPSA is a great name. So I'm very, very happy and privileged here to speak on this forum organized by BAPSA. So BAPSA, ASA, and these are the new names which are raising the concerns and stakes of philosophy beyond its academicist enclosure. So these are my three quick set of response. Now, one more thing I would like to add here. See, we should not get into this confusion of that there is something singular and exceptional thing called subcontinental philosophy. I think that is to be resisted. Philosophy, if it has to be affirmed in its anonymous universal sense. So at one level, the name philosophy is old ancient Greek name, but at another level, it's a certain universality. So it is a singular universality. So a desire for philosophy should not be the desire for claiming a subcontinental philosophy, as some people have recently tried to do. So that is one thing. And the second, that the desire for philosophy should not also be trying to find a philosophy in Indian history, which is basically to claim that there is something like an Indian philosophy, like Chinese and African and so on and so forth. No, one has to affirm unequivocally that the old word philosophy is essentially Platonic. So philosophy is Platonic, and there should be no confusion about that. But on the other hand, this Platonic operation has to be thought together along with the Buddhist operation on the common word religion, which is essentially a philosophical operation. So philosophy, and that is, I think, Ambedkar's wager, has entered the Indian history via the other common name religion, which is the proper name Dhamma and Buddhism. So today, I think we need to, in a way, kind of return to this intimate dialectical relation between Dhamma and philosophy. So,
Yeah, there was another question, like Abhishek,
Abhishek,
like
yeah.
by Abhishek Anita. He says that thanks for the talk, sir. What do you think about the roles that played by approaches of deconstruction, hermeneutics, phenomenology in bringing philosophy. So it's a sixth state, right?
Sure, sure. No, it's a very, very crucial
Yeah.
question. In my very
So he
sketchy and
again another question he adds that, do you think breaking the academic barriers can be a way of overcoming of the sickness of philosophy?
sure, sure. So I'll take the first question first, Abhishek. Thank you so much for this extremely important question. See, through my hasty presentation, I may have sounded kind of against these various currents. No, that is not the case at all. They have played a very crucial and important role. Deconstruction, phenomenology, hermeneutic, and so on and so forth, all the tendencies which talked about. I think the most important thing it did is to deconstruct the metaphysics. And the classical metaphysics had saturated. The dialectics had turned totalizing and authoritarian, both in its philosophical, metaphysical sense as well as the political outcomes of it. So that task was very, very crucial, no doubt about it. But what has happened is that after this end of metaphysics and end of philosophy, there hasn't been a recommencement, a reformulation of new metaphysics and new philosophy, except Gilles Deleuze and Alabadieu in the second half of 20th century. So in a certain sense, the great historical, intellectual, political task performed by these various tendencies, deconstruction, phenomenology, hermeneutic, and so on and so forth, has on the one hand kind of freed us from the strictures of the classical metaphysics. But on the other hand, today, we need to also construct our own metaphysics. That is what Deleuze and Badiou reminded us. Now, what is basically creation or construction of new metaphysics? I will just enlist 4 points here, and which will kind of help us kind of think through the second question which you asked. So the first is that we need to affirm truth once more and separate it from mere opinions. But while doing that, we should also simultaneously, in the same voice, says that one is not. So truth is not one. There are multiple truths, but multiple truths do not lead to relativism, because philosophy can compose the consequences of these multiple truths vis-a-vis each other. So multiple truths do not cancel each other. The second is that the question of subject. So deconstruction and many other have phenomenology and so on, have tried to critically investigate the question of subject. Today, by subject, we should not mean body, we should not mean individual, we should not even mean consciousness, and so on and so forth, with a certain insistence on authenticity and so on. Basically, we should separate subjectivity and subject, the phenomenological idea and the philosophical idea. The philosophical idea of subject is reformulated in two traditions, psychoanalysis and philosophy. In philosophy, Alabadieu reformulates subject as a verb simultaneously split between its active and passive senses. So we know that subject, in the sense subject, predicate, and so on in a sentence, has an active sense, and the passive is that you are subjected to something. So basically, subject is the moment where an individual subjects oneself to truth, any truth, artistic, political, scientific, but through one's own decision. So the individual decides to change, and through this free act, this radically free act, he makes himself a servant of that truth, or to use Alabadieu's specific word, a local point in the unfolding of the consequences of this truth. So basically, subject is the local work of truth. That is the second part one needs to reformulate. And third is the figure of dialectics as a very, very important figure that today we need to reformulate by shifting the emphasis from the power of negative and the labor of negative, so to say, to the inaugural affirmation. So any dialectic begins with the affirmation of the emergence of new truth, and in the light of this new truth, you destruct the existing hierarchies, you destruct the existing world in which you live in. So unless there is an emergence of truth, there is no philosophy. So philosophy is conditioned by the emergence of truth, but philosophy does not produce truth of its own. Philosophy is not master. Philosophy is on the receiving end of the truths. So the task of philosophy, as Alabadio says, is basically like a warehouse. It actually affirms that something like a truth has emerged, where rest of the world is trying to reduce or turn it into a mere opinion. So philosophy is trying to basically separate exceptional change and banal change, and tell us that something has happened here. And it also conceptualizes truth and consequences of that specific truth which has emerged in the world, and also composes the relation between these various truths. So only through reformulating these three questions, truth, subject, and dialectics, today we can reformulate something like philosophy. Now, the second question you are asking, can I see that question once more, Gautam? Abhishek's second question, or can yeah, absolutely. So the breaking the academic barriers can be a way of overcoming the sickness of philosophy. Precisely that the question of truth, subject, and dialectic concerns anyone. So anyone who thinks, now it may be the case that these are technical names used by philosophy as a certain kind of academic register. But today the task is unpack the intensity and force of these technical words, transmit the force of these technical words through other registers. It could be an artistic register as well, but it could be one will have to invent new registers to break that academic barrier. And the second point, in fact, I would like to say is that in the light of our encounter with philosophy at the University of Margins, we need to also question and change our relations with the disciplines in which we are working. We can no longer allow ourselves to be captured by disciplines or the mirage of transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity or post-disciplinarity, which are essentially another way of bringing the question of discipline back again and again. So today, I think the task of philosophy has to be understood as vocation of thinking, as desire for truth. And in the light of the existential effect philosophy produces upon us, then in the light of that, we should engage with the academic canon of philosophy. Otherwise, it is a merely academicist engagement. Yeah. Can I add, Gautam, one more point?
Yes,
I think,
yes, sure.
which is related to my earlier response, that today we should also resist this post-colonial temptation of turning philosophy as European, as Eurocentric, calling it Western, and then trying to look for some kind of a non-Western intellectual canons and so on. See, the point is very, very simple, that if there is a certain universality which emerged in any historical situation or any culture, it is essentially for anyone who thinks anywhere in the world. So there is no special kind of a possessive claim any culture or history can make on thinking, on philosophy. So first we will have to default ourselves from the debt we owe to the West and the Europe and so on and so forth. So that is the first point. And the second point is that we need to regain the confidence to think. We should not kind of exhaust ourselves by constantly undertaking the task of critiquing this, critiquing that, and so on and so forth. Critique has, in a certain sense, exhausted. The power of negative or negation has exhausted because we are no longer affirming the emergence of new truth, and in the light of that, undertaking the process of critique. So the sequence of the question of critique has to be repositioned. So today, in the light of the emergence of the new truth of equality declared by Ambedkar, we should undertake the critique of the ancient Indian history. But we should not get trapped into this disciplinary kind of a fascination of deconstructing history for its own sake. Or deconstructing historicist tendencies and moving from history to pasts and memory and all kinds of things which continue to happen. The question of history is essentially a question of exceptional change. So at any cost, I think the name history has to be, and historical or historicity has to be retained. And for that, as Soumyavrata Chaudhary proposes in his book, there has to be a separation between history and historicity. See, today my reading is that the biggest stumble or obstacle in our relation to history is historians. Historians have become the gatekeepers. They have reduced history, both the positivist as well as the post-positivist current after Foucault and deconstruction, have all reduced the question of philosophy to empiricism, to facts. They do not make separation between fact and truth. They do not affirm the subjective, partisan, militant nature of subjective relation to truth. So in a way, they do not make separation between history as a totality, as a continuum, or as an archive, and historicity, which is an exceptional change inaugurated in history. So essentially, they do not make distinction between history and event. So today, I think the real task before us, a true philosophical task, is to overcome these merely historicist tendencies. We should historicize, we should contextualize, but without giving up the desire for truth, or desire for universality and eternity.
Yeah.
Atanu had asked one question.
Yeah,
And
yes,
yeah.
yes. So this is the question by Professor Tanu Bhattacharya. It says
Yeah.
that does the agora,
The
the street, the market in the Greek sense, produce an effective philosophy? Is this what Ambedkar is getting finally?
Yes, yes. I thank you so much, Atanu, for raising this absolutely crucial question. I was immediately reminded of a certain group formed in Jawaharlal Nehru University after 2014, and its name was Agora. So it affirmed this role played by the street or the market-like situation, where people come together outside of any kind of an academicist or scholarly pursuits to think together, to think collectively. So I believe here one needs to actually approach this question at two levels. The first is the tension between Agora and Plato's academy after Socrates' brutal assassination or murder. So what actually Plato is trying to do through this new form academy, and what happens to it after Plato, what is done to the form of academy by Aristotle, what happens to the form of academy once the Christianity comes into picture, and the split between the monastic and the scholastic, what happens to the question of university towards the end of the Christian Middle Ages and the beginning of Renaissance, where a certain new kind of university emerges in England, particularly in Oxford and Cambridge. What happens to the name university at a later point when, particularly, and here I'm kind of skipping some historical steps in between, but coming to 20th century, that after the Second World War, what happens to the name university once it is captured by the military-industrial complex in America? And simultaneously, there is another kind of university which is emerging in Germany and France in the wake of the post-war discontent with the world. So you have something like a Freie University of Berlin and University of Paris 8 and so on, or the way Sorbonne is transformed into a new revolutionary desire. So I think in all of this, today what we are seeing is that the new possibility inaugurated within the space of university by May 68 across the world has saturated. Today, what we see in last 10, 12 years is emergence of something like university at the margins, where instead of transforming the university space in its institutional form, I think the desire is to kind of operate at a distance from the institutional enclosure and to create a new conversations between the university and the world. So, which is why the margin. So probably one could say that that margin is Agora, if one is following a certain Greek itinerary. If one is following the Buddhist kind of a sequence, one could call it Sangha. So Agora and Sangha could be the two names today to make us think about this collective form of thinking together while changing. So I believe that the affective charge of, and here I do not mean that one should uncritically accept either of these names. One should not simply look at them as historical names, but as a possibility for new forms to emerge. Because we know that the form of Sangha also desaturated in the course of history. And I'm not a student of ancient Indian history or Buddhism or so on, but from whatever little I know, that it has also led to all kinds of fragmentations within the history of Buddhism and so on. There have been many contested questions in the history of Sangha, particularly the question of women and celibacy and possession and the tension between dialectics and salvation and so on and so forth. But today, can we reinvent Agora and Sangha in our own voice? What will be our Agora and Sangha? I think that is a question today we'll have to ask. But essentially, by keeping in mind what you said so beautifully, that retaining the affective charge of philosophy or affective charge of thought. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Kriya.
another question is by Kriya Sharma. Does the understanding of subject as a local point for unfolding the truth also lead us towards post-humanistic thinking?
Uh, well, I would say that it actually rids us of this fascination of postism, that post-human, postmodern, post-structuralist, basically declaring the end of everything. I think what it does, that it basically produces a new dialectic between human and that which is not human, what Alabadi calls inhuman. So here one need to actually look at how this happens. See, all along in the history, the finite mortal human existence was dialectically thought together with something infinite, with something inexhaustible, with something immortal. Now, the classical name for that in certain traditions and cultures was God, right? So, what happens with the gradual disappearance of God from the scene in 19th century or towards its ends, what we generally call as a death of God, it creates a new crisis. It basically creates a crisis now that the human existence is reduced to finite mortal existence. We do not have any other horizon. We cannot really become something else or alien to ourselves, which is to say we cannot really convert to something else than what we are born. So we are in a way doomed to remain who we are. And in a certain way, Martin Heidegger's deconstruction of metaphysics also indirectly and in certain places directly contributes to this tendency, where the being or the subject is understood in being towards death, where suddenly the question of death and care and theology, all of it kind of comes onto the scene. Now, today, the question of post-humanism is posed again. Not to offend you or the question you're proposing, again within a certain disciplinary constellation. We see post-humanism is emerging as a certain kind of humanities, digital humanities, several names it takes, at the intersection of various disciplines in the transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, post-disciplinary sense. And there is a certain kind of a fascination that this is a new thing happening, and it is in a way chic and cool, and so on and so forth. Also, there is a certain implied fascination for dystopia there, or end there, which is kind of fueled by our fascination for dystopic science fictions consumed quite popularly in our times, or anything dystopic is something which attracts us deeply. So, in a way, departing from all of these tendencies, today I think the question of subject has to be understood as a neoclassical question. So, as an old question, but reformulated. Or to use Ambedkar's metaphor, that it is an old wine which has to be formulated, which has to be put in new bottle. The way Ambedkar does vis-a-vis Navayana. That Navayana is a name of a new bottle, but the truth of it is ancient or old, or in that sense eternal, because it is a truth, it has to be eternal. So, subject has been the concern of philosophy all along. Rather, the question of philosophy and its, I in fact divided in my discussion the two aspects of truth, the eternity and its historical effectivity or its historical unfolding, and so on and so forth. I think all along the question of truth was coupled with the question of subject, or creating a new subjective desire. So we should not actually try to again entertain these new names, post-humanist. I mean, we can of course do that for disciplinary reasons, but I think the proper task of thinking today would be to say that the question of subject is a philosophical question, and it is not a disciplinary question. It's not an academicist question. It's an existential question. It is essentially a question of, in a certain sense, what Kant asked at one point: what should I do? And while refusing limits upon one's knowledge by proclaiming a certain infinity of thought. So in a certain sense, the question of subject today has to be thought on the side of the truth processes, politics, artistic, scientific, and amorous, in a real, actual material world. And I don't think that material world can simply be divided between the humanist and post-humanist phases, the way the disciplines sort of make us believe. But yes, what we need today is a new dialectic between finite and infinite, human and inhuman, immanence and another world, but another world which still remains immanent to this world, as an inconsistency in this world, as a possibility in this world. So yeah, so basically I think the dialectical operation on these terms or these couples or pairs, finite, infinite, immanence, and transcendence, can help us think the question of subject. And here I would suggest, in fact, that there is something fascinating which Alabadio does before he undertakes the construction of new metaphysics, is the great seminar which he proposes called Theory of Subject. I think one should begin from that and then come to this whole question of subject as truth process. Because in Theory of Subject, what he is taking head on is basically this question of what is the structure of subject? How does something like subject emerges? And here I think, in a certain sense, his master or his interlocutor is the anti-philosopher Jacques Lacan. So Jacques Lacan should be, I think, the another entry point into the question of subject or psychoanalysis, the Freud-Lacanian sequence, so to say. And I would say that the difference between the psychoanalytic and the philosophical tradition is very productive for us to think the question of subject, instead of posing it in the post-humanist sort of a way. And what is the precise nature of this tension? That Alabadio, on the side of philosophy, does not make distinction between subject and subjectivation. So subject is becoming subject to the process of truth. So the word subject cannot be used to the general structure of subjectivity, the way psychoanalysis uses. But interestingly, on the other hand, what psychoanalysis does is that it uses the word subjectivity to basically does something what Buddha did in his own time, which is to kind of bring us back to the constitutive lack which structures any subjectivity, or the kind of split between the nature and the culture, that there is no evolutionary continuum from nature and culture. So this constitutive lack actually creates a certain desire, certain drives, certain instincts, and so on and so forth. The word Freud used Triebe, and where the human animal is at once a part of the animal world, but is not entirely a part of the animal world, but he is not entirely belonging to another world like culture or civilization. So the human animal is constitutively split, and this split cannot be again merged into one. And the most important consequence of this today is to resist the neurobiological wager that basically subject is reducible to brain or to neurobiological operations and so on and so forth. So yeah, this is what I would say.
Yeah, thank you. There is another question by Apurva Herur. She says that is it possible to be a convert in the sense of decision and commitment to the principle while remaining and at the same time challenging the existing social order, say the Hindu social order?
Yeah. I think if we go by Ambedkar's decision on the name Hindu in the undelivered speech Annihilation of Caste, I think he very categorically says that you cannot do that. You will first have to leave this name behind. Why? Because first of all, the true religious task is to destroy that which masquerades itself as religion of principles, but is nothing but religion of rules, is basically cruelty. So I don't think one can convert without exiting Hinduism. I don't think that is possible. For two reasons. First is the socio-symbolic reason, the word Hindu or the effect it produces in the real material world. See, we have to keep in mind that there is always this possibility, the shape-shifting thing or monstrosity called Hinduism allows to call yourself not a Hindu. You can simply be rationalist, simply be atheist, simply be liberal, simply be secular, in a way not publicly identifying yourself with name Hindu, but that does not dislodge the social, symbolic, and political power of the name Hindu. It actually indirectly only supports it. And that is precisely what we have seen. That has led to the liberal secular impasse of the Nehruvian state at a certain point. So if we have to politically dislodge the symbolic effects of the name Hindu, on the popular imagination, one will have to exit the name, in a way give up the name and take a new name. Because as Ambedkar reminds us, in a way from Hindus, that name matters. So in a way, you cannot be Shakespearean saying that you call Rose by any other names and it'll smell the same. No, some name stinks, so some names have to be kept behind. So, and I think this is quite categorically stated by Ambedkar in Annihilation of Caste. But unfortunately, today, historians who are obsessed with the contextualist, historicist orientations want to dig the 1920s efforts Ambedkar was making of reforming Hinduism as a new possibility for us today. And they have very strange kind of conclusions that Ambedkar eventually exited Hinduism because of certain disillusionment and failures which he faced vis-a-vis the caste Hindus. So it's basically out of a certain kind of a sense of rejection by the caste Hindus that, and I think that has to be resisted tooth and nail, academically or otherwise. I think there is no going back after 1936 to any project of reforming Hinduism in any sense, as a culture, civilization, way of life, whatever you call it. I think all of these names do not do anything to the power of symbolic effects of the name Hindu. So does that answer the question, Apurva? Yeah, Tanu's second question.
Yes.
Is the technology?
Yeah, you read.
Is the technological intervention in Heidegger, for example, also a question of the technologization of a religion that can produce the current political impasse? Absolutely. And I look at either philosophy or religion simply as instruments of social change in that technological manner. Yet, I would suggest that we actually need to reframe from thinking the question of technology entirely through the Heideggerian lens. So, and why? Because, see, any truth emerges, unfolds, and actualizes itself in the world through material processes, right? So, any truth, in a way, in order to come into existence, needs to use, quote unquote, certain tools. So, the question of instrument and use is essentially tied to the effectivity of truth procedures in this world. And here I think Alabadio makes it very clear vis-a-vis the theological or the secular atheist currents of his time. He says that St. Paul is the model of universalism or foundations of universalism, or a model of the subject for truth, or a militant fidel subject of truth. Why is he saying that? Isn't he aware of the technologization of Christianity and whatever happened in the name of Christianity or in the name of Islam, even in the name of Buddhism, in the name of Judaism, and so on and so forth, or continues to happen in all of these names? What I think Alabadiu reminds us there is one should not approach the question of religion from the side of theology, but from the side of philosophy. So either St. Paul or Buddha or Anand, I'm here referring to the ancient Anand in the Buddhist period, each of them have to be understood as militants of a new political truth, not new religious or theological truth. So the name Christianity here has to be taken very carefully as a proper name for a new collective organization which has decided to remain indifferent to other names like Jews and Greeks and so on and so forth. So you can be anyone, but yet you can, in a way, come together under this new name, church. Now, Heidegger would say that no, but then you are basically instrumentalizing this kind of organ called church. But how would a truth actualize itself without any instrument in that sense, or without any tool, or without actually doing something or giving some concrete shape or form? So in that sense, at certain later point, that the Vanguardist Party is also a major instrument of bringing about social change or transformation and so on and so forth. So I would suggest that while remaining very attentive to the saturation of these truth processes, where Heidegger will be of a great help to us to remind us of the technologization of each of these names, be it party, or it could be Sangha, it could be Agora, it could be academy, it could be university, or any other name. But at the same time, not giving up the desire to re-signify some of these names, to give new content and new form to it, the way Ambedkar did in his own times. Wasn't he aware of what was happening or had happened in the name of historical Buddhism? Wasn't Alabadio aware of what happened in the name of historical Marxism? Why either Ambedkar or Badio does not give up the desire to continue to use the name Buddhism or communism in their own voice, while wagering upon their universality and so on and so forth. So there, I think we should actually be a little more confident that we may fail, but let's fail better and fail better. And that's what, in a way, Beckett and Laka, and in a certain sense, Alabadi also reminds when he says, keep going. Let's not be too bothered, because I think this whole Heideggerian critique has taken away our confidence of instrumentalizing something. So, yeah. It has made us too ethical and not political enough. Yeah. Kamayani's question, how to avoid the danger of essentialism when theorizing the subject, especially with regarding developing the subject in relation to truth. What is a robust mutating process-based account of the subject? I think here it's a very, very crucial question, and I think the deconstruction challenging the essential nature of subject, that it is trying to dislodge subject and essence, right? So, and that's why the great existentialist declaration that existence precedes essence. So yes, essence is a problem. Now, we have to very, very gently and carefully separate name and thing. So name of a subject, proletariat, woman, Dalit, Muslim, Buddhist, from the thing, the unnameable thing, which is named by this proper name. Now, this unnameable thing is not an essence in any transcendental sense, in any fixed eternal kind of a sense. Yet, after Hegel, sorry for this Freudian slip, after Hegel, we should be very confident to say that that unnameable thing is a subject, which is also, that unnameable thing is a substance, but is also subject. So the very important Hegel's reminder in the introduction of Phenomenology of Spirit, that substance is subject. For that, we have to rethink what do we mean by substance itself, or what do we mean by materialism itself. Materialism cannot simply be exhausted by that which come under the deterministic fold, under the positivistic fold, under the fold of that which is in 20th century was called structuralism. So materialism is structure plus exception, which is internal or immanent to structure. So subject is a name of that immanent inconsistency of structure itself. That is, I think, where Alabadio inaugurates his new theory of subject, taking off from Laka, that we should not separate structure and subject. Otherwise, we run into the false sociological problems of structure and agency kind of a problem. And then we have very miserable solutions like structuration and so on. So I think this whole question of agency cannot be uncoupled or has to be dialectically maintained into the relation with structure. Alabadio gives a more kind of a ontological consistency to this operation. So being is that which has a structure, right? And that structure can be grasped rationally through mathematics as set theory, or mathematics as ontology. Now, does that mean that mathematics exhausts all that can be known about being? No, there is something like event, which is immanent inconsistency to structure itself. So from there, let's come back to the question of essence. We should affirm that if there is an essence, that essence is inconsistent to itself. So self is becoming other to the self, or subject is becoming an alien to oneself. So I think the immanent otherness, which is affirmed by psychoanalysis and Laka, should be our cue to make sense of subject as a truth process, as unfolding of a truth process. Here I would add one more small footnote, which basically takes off from Alabadio's, in a way, magisterial reformulation of Plato's Republic, which, as Soumyavrata Chaudhary at some point said, is homologous to Ambedkar's writing Buddha and his Dhamma in his own voice. In the same way, Alabadio writes Plato's Republic in his own way, through his own voice. Towards the end of the end of Plato's Republic, Alabadio's Plato's Republic, there's a discussion of what is subject. There, I think Plato reminds us of the old Platonic lesson that subject is not reducible to body. Body is finite, is mortal, But subject, since it's a process of truth, unfolding of truth, it remains immortal. And from there comes the title of Shamimrita Chaudhary's book, Ambedkar and Other Immortals. So I think at the threshold of our 20th century preoccupation as well as exhaustion with mortality and finitude, the question of subject has to be reposed. Because today what has happened, all the backdoor entry of essentialization come because we again kind of equate subject with body and continue to think subject only in that embodied and bodily sense, in a phenomenological sense, and we valorize experience and its authenticity and so on and so forth. As a very beautiful article by Rajat Ray I had a privilege to read, which appeared in EPW this week or last week, where he said that, see, the whole question of experience has to be reformulated, that the experience becomes thinkable after the decision to become somebody else, after the decision to change. So Ambedkar's experience of being a Dalit, being an untouchable, which was an extremely dehumanizing experience, became thinkable because of his decision to change. So only in the light of the subjective decision to change, all the bodily experiential content can be accessed as a thought and not merely as a viscerality or emotion or affectivity. Essentially, we have to overcome the false distinction between sensing in the experiential sense and making sense as thinking. So I think, and that is what precisely I think Hegel was trying to do vis-a-vis Kant, where he says that reason is basically the name of both these operations, what we call emotion and understanding. We cannot really create this kind of a split between the faculties, which we are later trying to synthesize through some transcendental operation and so on. Yeah. There are ideas about the processual ontology in Buddhism, becoming, in the case of Pratitya Samudpath, and can these be valuable? Absolutely, absolutely. But again, I think the whole question of becoming has to be dialectically thought in relation to being. What has happened is, because of this whole fascination with becoming as a incessant, forever becoming, we have actually lost the dialectical relation between becoming and being, between constancy and change, between eternity and ephemerality, between permanence and impermanence. And which is why today, the way we are approaching, I think, Pratitya Samudpath through the great Tibetan masters of our time, but we are approaching it in a very nihilist and a cynical way, where we celebrate impermanence of life, where there is nothing eternal, or there is nothing universal, or there is nothing infinite, or there is nothing inexhaustible. So basically, we are celebrating this whole question of becoming non-dialectically via Deleuze, or Deleuzianism, not Deleuze per se, because Deleuze can be thought in a different way. That's what Alabadio reminds us. So because of a certain celebration of Deleuze, we celebrate the becoming in a sense of celebration of differences as irreducible to any kind of sameness, or celebration of multiples and so on. So I think today, if we are to reinvent or return to the great insights of the Pratitya Samudpath and the whole question of becoming, I think we have to approach it dialectically. And in fact, a line from Buddha and his Dhamma comes to my mind, which we need to read critically, which is being is becoming. It is very well possible to read being in becoming in a non-dialectical way, but I think Ambedkar gives us sufficient reasons to not read him non-dialectically. I think that's precisely what I was trying to present today, that the relation between the philosophy and religion, or that split between the philosophy in the academicist sense and social philosophy, or religion of rules and religion of principles. Ambedkar or the distinction he makes between mere life and true life, I think this is a Platonic distinction. Ambedkar is Platonist, is dialectical, in a certain sense Hegelian, not in the sense you tend to use the word Hegelian in the anti-Hegelian way. No, in the proper dialectical sense, as an affirmative dialectics, where the emergence of a new truth in history is the inauguration of any dialectical unfolding. So I think in the light of all of this, probably we can speak in our own voice about the Pratitya Samudpath without celebrating either the impermanence as something which kind of elevates all our burdens of the present, that and in a way, it also creates a certain kind of a subjective disorientation and confusion that it demotivates us from doing anything in some way, because anyway it is impermanent. So that's kind of a demobilization happens. And the second is that it kind of inclines us from taking the responsibility of our own thought and speaking the language of philosophy, which affirms eternity and permanence and the question of being and subject and truth and infinite and so on. Suddenly you are made to appear that you are like a totalitarian, absolutist, authoritarian. We have forgot to make distinction between absolute and absolutist. So I think if we are cautious of these tendencies and their celebration, probably we have a greater chance of re-articulating, reinventing the great insights of the Mahayana Buddhism.
Yeah. So I think we have already been running out of time.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think we are not taking more questions. So thank you so much for your incisive lecture. There have been many informations. There were many different concepts and different information, like various informations which we didn't have access to, but your lecture gave us those insightful information, and thank you so much. And we are in a way honored to have you, like honored having you here, and we are looking forward to inviting you again and again. And yeah, so like you can express your words.
Sure, of course. No, I'm really overwhelmed. Let me be very frank and honest that this has been one of the absolutely fascinating and unprecedented kind of an intellectual exchange which has happened here in last couple of hours. I'm very, very thankful to Pradhani, to Gautam, and to everyone in BAPSA CUG for this great initiative. See, I think this is precisely the space what Atanu was talking about, which can be named as Agora or Sangha. I think these online exchanges to which we are forced to because of the pandemic, we can actually turn our back and reaffirm these spaces to continue to think together despite our physical separation, despite our isolation, that the whole thought of association, Ambedkarite, communist, or any association of the emancipatory politics of truth, or politics as truth procedure, I think should continue. And I'm very, very thankful for inviting me. And it's been a great privilege for me to speak here today. And I'm looking forward to more such exchanges in future.
Yeah.
And
So
thank you
I
all the
think
questioners actually for great questions, absolutely fascinating questions.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, I think we are winding up, and I think there will be no more questions to be taken. And yeah, so I think we are departing, and yeah, the way I'm saying that it's like it's an honor to be here and having you here.
Yeah.
And
Can I say
having
one last thing?
yeah,
That
sure,
in a
sure,
certain
sure,
sense,
sure.
this talk was scheduled around Mahaparinirvan. Then, what I propose is that it's also the day on which we should celebrate the immortality of Ambedkar-thought. So, on the one hand, we remember the finite mortal existence of a person called B.R. Ambedkar. On the other hand, this should precisely be the occasion to celebrate the immortality of Ambedkar-thought.
Yeah. So thank